Is that guy staring at you though? The guy staring at you, he's waiting to kick you out. Hey Pinkers, I'm Mike Levy and Crank Week is back. It's actually right over there. So we're gonna take a walk through the village and look for some bikes. I'm gonna try to find some new bikes, I'm gonna try to find some old bikes, but more than anything, I'm just gonna try to find some interesting bikes. So come with me, let's go for a walk. All right, everybody, Crankworx is not a trade show, but that doesn't mean that there aren't some interesting bikes to find, including this brand new prototype, unreleased Knolly. How do I know it's a prototype? Well, it says prototype in massive letters on the top tube, and because Noel told me. This is the brand new Endorphin. Let's start with the numbers first. You can have it with either 135, 140, or 150 millimeters of rear wheel travel, depending on your shock setup. You can run up to a 160 millimeter fork up front if you want. Now, Knolly is also adding some sizes here. All the sizes are gonna grow a little bit in length, but they're also gonna add an extra small, and get this, it fits a 175 millimeter dropper post. Now, the other thing to mention here, you could run this with a mullet if you want, or you could run it dual 29. This is a mullet setup, as you see right here. If you're so short that you're actually a child, Knolly will also be planning on releasing a youth version of this bike with 26-inch wheels. That bike sounds like a whole bunch of fun. So we've covered the numbers. Let's zoom in on some details here because some stuff has changed, including up here. Now, they used to use bushings at the top of the linkage to help save weight, and there's some argument to be made that the bushings actually make for a stiffer rear end. Well, this is bearings now, so it should run even smoother for much longer. There's also titanium hardware holding this thing together, and a new one-piece 3D forged link up here that's said to add some rigidity to the frame. Now, another thing to mention, 157 millimeter wide hub spacing like all of Knolly's previous bikes. It's also going to use a UDH compatible derailleur hanger. So if you're out somewhere and you break your hanger, you can put a normal UDH hanger on there that I think those are relatively inexpensive. But the one that the bike comes with is going to be a much more robust version of the UDH. So there's that. As with the previous Endorphins, this bike can be a lot of things. If you want to run a coil sprung shock on it, you could definitely do that. You could also obviously put an air sprung shock. And while we're talking about suspension, Knolly has made some slight changes to the kinematics to make it a little more progressive. So that is our look at the new prototype Endorphin. When is this thing going to be released? Summer 2023. So it is a ways away. Let's keep wandering around the village and see what else we can find. You know what we're always looking at here? New bikes. You know what's more interesting sometimes? Old bikes, which is exactly what this Marin Pine F.R.S. is. Now, I think this is from 1994, and this is the steel version of the Pine F.R.S. that sold for $2,300 back in 1994, I think, which would equal 4,400 American dollars today. Just look at this. I mean, this is an interesting bike, but it gives you an idea of how much bike we're getting for our money these days. So there was also a titanium version that no doubt cost a whole bunch more, and it was actually the bike that Jürgen Bennecke raced to the Downhill World Championships in 1993. Now, he did that with Manitou suspension front and back. Now, this is an elastomer Manitou fork on the front and an elastomer Manitou fork on the rear. Now, I have no idea how much travel it has. I don't think it has a damper or anything like that, but it is definitely interesting. Let's just see how much it moves. Okay, I think we'll need to microwave the elastomers in there and maybe make them a little bit squishier. A couple other things to point out on this thing. It's got a threaded headset. It has cantilever brakes that actually feel really nice and firm. And those things are clamping down onto rims that look, well, they look about 10 millimeters wide. I'm sure they're a little wider than that, but they are very, very skinny. It also has an original XT drivetrain on it, which, I mean, I love to see. Even the 3 chain rings up there. Pretty interesting stuff. All right, the next interesting bike we're gonna look at is Scor's 4060Z. Now, if you saw our field test from a while back, We tested the regular 4060 there. Well, obviously this is the one with the motor. Now it has 140 or 160 millimeters of travel, just like that non-motorized bike. And you adjust that travel by, well, you don't need to buy a new shock or anything. There's 2 shock mounting positions at the bottom, and you remove a travel limiting spacer, and that gives you your extra 20 millimeters of rear wheel travel. Now, it's got an EP8 motor down there with a 726 watt-hour battery. So this is a full-size e-bike. You're gonna be out there for a long time without running out of juice. Up front, you have adjustable geometry via these 2 headset cups that you can actually rotate. They're oval shaped. You can rotate them in the frame to adjust how the bike handles. Now, since we're talking about geometry, the rear end on this bike is 435 millimeters for all the sizes. Now that is pretty dang short for an e-bike with a 29-inch rear tire. Now they managed to do that by rotating the motor, that EP8 motor, very slightly in the frame, but also the suspension design lets them tuck that rear wheel right up against the frame. We're gonna talk about suspension a little bit now because this is actually, it looks the same as the normal 4060, but they've actually made some big kinematic changes that are worth mentioning. Now on this bike with the motor, when you're at the sag point, it has plenty of anti-squat to make it feel sporty. But once you go past that sag point, unlike the non-motorized 4060, the anti-squat numbers fall right off on this bike, and that gives you way more traction. The thing is a motor, so you don't need it to feel super sporty and have a ton of anti-squat. So there you go, that is gonna give you a ton of traction. The last thing to mention, what's up with these bananas? I asked Scor about it, and they're actually offering a different sticker kit roughly every 6 months for you to freshen up your bike. If you want to add some flair, you can change it up every 6 months and make the bike look how you want it to look. Of course it's fucking windy, we can't just film a video. All right, now I am with Norco's brand new Fluid. Now you might have seen this bike on Pinkbike's homepage, but I finally have one. Now this is actually the exact model that I've been riding the shit out of here for testing during Crankworx. So before we get into taking a closer look at this bike, stay tuned for that review, not tomorrow. But the Fluid, let's get into some details. This is a 130 millimeter travel bike with a 140 millimeter fork that's kind of meant to do all the things reasonably well. And it's meant to do those things at a reasonable price. There are 4 complete models and they start off at $2,700 American and they top out at $4,450 for this bad boy that you see right here. Let's move on to some other numbers, specifically about the sizing. Now, Norco has added a size, a double extra large that they say will work for anybody up to 6'7". So if you're a beanstalk, well, this might be the bike for you, but there's also an extra small that'll work with anybody that's down to 5'1", so they have you covered there. Let's move on to the suspension, and like I said before, the 130 in the back, 140 up front, that's 10 millimeters more on both ends than the previous version of the Fluid, but there are some other changes as well. Norco has tweaked the anti-squat a little bit, and they've also made the bike a little bit more progressive, and that means that you might not have to fill your air can with spacers to get that progressivity if you like to send it. The other thing we're going to talk about before we leave, geometry. That's much more important than suspension. Norco uses something called ride-aligned geometry on their higher-end, more expensive bikes, but now they're also using it on the Fluid. So you could get ride-aligned starting at $2,700 American. And what is it? On the Fluid, that gives you a 65-degree head angle and the appropriate reach and all of the other numbers, but it also gives you size-specific rear center lengths and seat tube angles. So each size adjusts accordingly. So that means that if you're super tall or super short, the bike should still feel normal. Now, like I said earlier, I've got one of these for testing. I've been riding the piss out of it here. I'm gonna keep doing that after Crankworx, and you're gonna see a review of it at some point down the road. All right, everybody, that is it for our little walk around the Whistler Village during Crank Week, looking for interesting bikes. What do you guys think? What's the one that you like? I think the Marin is probably the bike that I'm gonna take down A-line next, so let's go do that and see how that works out.